Greetings and welcome to the CCOF Foundation webinar on organic and food safety record keeping for produce growers. We wanted to acknowledge that today's webinar is supported through a grant from the USDA Risk Management Agency. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this webinar are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the view of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Also note, this webinar is not providing legal advice. Today's webinar is intended for farms that must fully comply with the Food Safety Modernization Act, also known as FSMA, Produce Safety Rule. Our webinar speaker will review what records are required for farms that must fully comply with the Produce Safety Rule, and these records fall into 4 categories: personnel qualifications and training, agricultural water, biological, soil amendments of animal origin, which is just the really fancy way of saying manure and blood meal, that type of thing. And the final category is equipment, tools, buildings, and sanitation. After reviewing the FSMA record-keeping requirements for these categories, we will highlight how FSMA records may align with record-keeping requirements for the USDA National Organic Program. So if you're new to FSMA or you don't know if your farm needs to fully comply with the Produce Safety Rule, we encourage you to watch some of our earlier webinars that review the basics of FSMA prior to watching this webinar. Our speaker will provide a link to this resource in the introduction of her presentation. So in other words, we're really going into the weeds today, and we want to make sure that you need to know all this information before we give it all to you. If you're having difficulties connecting to the webinar, if you can't hear, can't see, please call our office for support at 831-423-2263. Press 0 for the operator, and someone will help you connect to the webinar. My name is Megan Donovan. I will be your host today. I'm a program specialist at the CCOF Foundation. The CCOF Foundation advances organic agriculture for a healthy world through education and hardship grants, technical assistance, and consumer education. My colleague Shannon Morris will also be joining us today. Shannon is a farm certification specialist with CCOF Certification Services. She'll be online to answer questions related to organic record-keeping requirements. Before we get started with the main presentation, I wanted to let you know how you can participate in today's web event. We're looking at an example of the GoToWebinar attendee interface, which is made up of 2 parts. The viewer window on the left, which allows you to see everything the presenter will see on the screen, and the control panel on the right. Within that control panel is how you can participate in today's event, so let's take a look at that. By clicking on the orange arrow, you can open and close the control panel. From the View menu, you can also set the control panel not to auto-hide when inactive if you prefer to always keep it open. The audio pane provides audio information. By default, you have joined the webinar via mic and speakers. If you prefer, you can join the audio via telephone by selecting phone call, and the dial-in information will be displayed. During the presentation, you can send questions to our webinar staff through the questions pane. Simply type your question and click send. Throughout the webinar, we will stop from time to time for questions and answers, and we'll answer as many questions as we have time for. As a final reminder, today's webinar is being recorded, and everyone will receive an email with a link to view the recording of today's event, along with a PDF of the PowerPoint slides. Today, we also have a copy of the PDF of the PowerPoint slides, as well as some other handouts available for download through GoToWebinar. Click on the blue file name of the handout in the Handouts pane. A PDF of the slides or handout will open in your internet browser. You can view them in your browser or download them onto your computer. To expand or collapse the handouts and questions panes, click on the triangle next to the name of the pane. For example, if you can't see the box of the questions pane, click on the triangle and it will expand to show the pane. So we wanted to invite you to write in, test out the questions pane, and let us know where you're calling in from today and what crops you grow. We'll loop back around to that information a little later in the presentation. And just to note, we have a nice crowd out there today, and so we're going to try to get as many questions as we can. But if we don't get to your specific question, please follow up with us afterwards. And we apologize that if we can't get to everyone's questions. So with that, I would like to introduce today's presenter. Kaylee Feiereisel serves as CAFF and the Farmers Guild Food Safety Specialist. She provides food safety technical assistance to farmers as they further develop their practices to meet new requirements. In addition to her background in diversified vegetable production, Kaylee recently studied food safety, local food systems, and food and agriculture policy while completing her graduate degree in public health nutrition at the University of California, Berkeley. So Kaylee, thank you for joining us again. It's always great to have you here, and I will turn things over to you.
Great, thanks, Megan. So just to kick things off, that was a great introduction. We wanted to do another interactive feature and have everyone on the webinar please fill out this quick audience poll. So Megan, I'll let you activate that, please.
All right. And this is just to kind of help us to get an idea of who's in the audience. So if you want to go ahead and answer the poll that's kind of popped up in your screen and let us know what category your farm falls under for FSMA. And we'll give everybody a couple seconds to fill that out. All right, so I'm going to close the poll and then you can kind of share it with everyone.
Okay, great. The people who said your farm is fully covered, aka needs to be in full compliance, this webinar and the records that we're going to talk about later will give you an excellent overview into what kind of records you need to keep as a farm that needs to be in full compliance with FSMA. Those farms that are fully exempt and qualified exempt and people who are not sure, I would recommend, as Megan mentioned, we'll show you the links for the previous webinars that really walk through the background information that I'm going to talk about today in the next few slides, but just briefly. So maybe the quick overview I'm about to do will give you a refresher and you'll remember or know which category your farm falls under. But if not, there's other resources that exist already that we really walk through the details. So thanks, Megan, for running that. Is there a way, Megan, to exit the poll and then go back to the slides, please? Thank you. Perfect. Great. So now let's dive into the details, and just want to have a quick preface here and say, try and not get overwhelmed. I know that there is a lot of information we're about to cover. You're going to have all of the slides from the presentation are on the right-hand handout bar section of the bar there. There's a PDF, slides _ organic and food safety. That one is the PDF of all these slides. You can go to our CAFF.org food safety website pages to learn more. And then we also attached in the right-hand column sidebar, there's the full text of the produce safety law or regulation, which is the FSMA Produce Safety Rule _ no preamble PDF. That is about 20 pages of the text of the law. And we'll also talk about more resources at the end of this presentation. So don't worry, there's a lot of resources out there, and hopefully they'll provide some guidance for you as you figure out what all of this means. Okay, here is a 10,000-foot overview of the presentation we're going to go on today. We're going to cover 4 main areas, like Megan mentioned. The first is what is on-farm food safety, then a brief overview of FSMA. I'm going to say FSMA instead of the Food Safety Modernization Act, just to save a few words there and be less tongue-tied. And then we're going to talk thirdly about FSMA and what are the record-keeping requirements for farms that need to be in full compliance or farms that are considered fully covered. And then fourth, we're going to talk about, okay, there's these 4 main categories where farms need to keep records, and then we're going to walk through each of those 4 categories and describe what the records are. Okay, so first, let's talk about what are the 3 main types of food contamination related to on-farm produce food safety. So the first area of contamination that might happen is physical contamination, where a screw falls off of a piece of equipment and lands in a crate of lettuce, or a staple falls out of something and lands in some, you know, a bin of broccoli, something like that. Physical is you can see it, you can usually just remove it, and then the contamination is significantly minimized. The second category is chemical contamination, and this deals with fertilizer residues or spraying. It might be like, you know, oil or lubricant from a piece of farm equipment might be leaking and fall or drop down onto crops. So that can be ways that food can be chemically contaminated. And then the third way is with biological contamination, and this is with viruses, bacteria, parasites, and fungi that make people sick, make humans sick if we were to eat them. And usually it's because we are not cooking produce, because so much of produce is eaten raw, and because it's eaten raw, that lettuce or whatever it might be, the tomatoes that have a pathogen on it, or what's a virus, bacteria, or parasite that makes us sick, those are often called pathogens as a overall term. And so if there's a pathogen on a tomato and we don't cook it and we just eat it raw, then it's likely to get us sick because it wasn't exposed to high heat or pressure or acidification or some sort of kill step that would have killed it. When we talk about on-farm food safety, and FSMA in particular is very, very focused on this third category of on-farm food contamination. So the biological or the microbial contamination that happens on farms is what this FSMA law and what the vast majority of our on-farm food safety work is towards, because biological contamination is what makes the most people sick. So that's why all of the regulation is focused on it. Okay, and then just a brief mention of a couple unfortunate food safety, foodborne illness outbreaks in the past. There was in 2011, a fresh strawberry farm in Oregon had some U-pick and farmers market berries that they were sending to markets, and unfortunately there was deer feces near them and on them, and some people got sick, and unfortunately one person died. And this is because that deer feces had E. coli 0157H7, which is a particularly dangerous strain of E. coli for if humans eat it. And so this is just an example that, like, food safety, on-farm food safety applies to smaller farms and larger farms, farms of all scales, because we as a whole industry, whether big, small, strawberry growers, lettuce growers, carrot growers, we're all in this together because we have to keep our food supply safe. So now we want to, that's a brief overview of what is on-farm food safety. And now we're going to do a brief overview of the Produce Safety Rule of the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA. So in 2011, President Obama signed FSMA into law, and it kind of happened at a tipping point where, like I just said, that there was that strawberry outbreak in 2011. There was also a big melon outbreak in 2011. And then there were other foodborne illness outbreaks that were happening more frequently. And so there was more of a public push for there to be something to be done. And until 2011, that was the first time, or when it happened in 2011, that was the first time that our federal food safety regulations were updated in 70 years, 70 years they hadn't been updated. So it was time to bring things up to speed. And then it took a few years for the Food and Drug, or the FDA administration, to implement the law and basically write the main sections of the law, or what they're called rules. So there's 7 main rules or sections of FSMA that apply to different parts of the supply chain. FSMA is very overarching across our whole food system. It applies at farm level, which is the Produce Safety Rule. It applies to manufacturers and processors and distributors, which is the Preventative Controls Rule. It applies to transportation companies. There's a transportation rule. There's a specific regulation for import of food into the country, so from other farms around the world. It even applies to animal food. So it's very comprehensive and covers a large part of our food supply system. But today we're specifically focused on the Produce Safety Rule, or the PSR, the Produce Safety Rule here, because that is what's focused on at the farm level. And then we have just kind of passed this regulation implementation and education phase, and then starting in April this spring, enforcement regulation or educational enforcement has started around the country for the largest farms, which are those that have over 500,000 in gross sales, as well as continuing education like what we're doing right now, and learning more about the regulation and how farms can get into compliance and up to speed, because this is a huge change. There's a lot of things a lot of people have to learn, so we're just still in that process now. Okay, and then if you weren't aware of it, it's important to note that FSMA is not prescriptive. So if you take a look at the text of the law that we have here as a PDF, and that the link is down on this slide, you'll see that there's a lot of language in there that does not say specifically in black and white what you need to do. There's a lot of phrases like reasonably necessary and necessary and appropriate, and that can be frustrating as a farmer at first, because you just want to know, just tell me what to do, or make it clear what I need to do. And the law is not like that for the most part. But that's good, because you as a farmer can assess the unique risks and circumstances on your farm and take the appropriate action and response to that to help reduce and minimize food safety risks. So this will be brought up in other contexts as we go. Okay, as we mentioned or alluded to in that poll at the beginning, there are 3 different farm categories that farms get classified into under this federal food safety law. Some farms are considered fully exempt, and some farms are considered qualified exempt. Those farms categories we covered in depth in this link to this previous CCOF webinar. And then the 3rd farm category are farms that have over $500,000 in average gross sales, averaged together and adjusted for inflation over the last 3 years, or the farms that need to be in full compliance have less than $500,000 in adjusted gross food sales, but they don't sell at least 50.1% of their sales to a qualified end user. And a qualified end user is a consumer, a restaurant, or a retail food establishment like one grocery store that is located in the same state or Indian reservation as the farm, or not within 275 miles from the farm. So yeah, this is just important to note, because it's not just a hard $500,000 financial threshold. It also matters if you have less than $500,000 in gross sales. It really depends on where you're selling that food, because if you're selling it all locally at a farmer's market, then you would qualify for the qualified exemption. But if you're selling it all to a distributor or a broker or a wholesaler, even if you only have 100,000 in sales, you would not qualify for the qualified exemption, because you're not selling at least the majority or 50.1% of sales to qualified end users. But I know that was kind of a lot, and a lot of using the word qualified in there. So hopefully you didn't get lost in that, but if you are, I highly recommend checking out those previous webinars where we spent an hour just walking through these details. Okay, and then just to note that the $500,000 adjusted for inflation in 2011 dollars is a migrating value every year. So now that's actually up to $550, $551, and that is worthwhile to note if you are calculating this and your farm gross sales are right around there. Okay, and then we mentioned here that there's 3 different farm categories under FSMA: the fully exempt, qualified exempt, or fully covered. What do fully covered farms need to do under FSMA? Well, there's a number of different categories here. As you see, there's requirements in worker training and qualifications. There's requirements for worker health and hygiene, for soil amendments, for natural resources, for buildings, tools, equipment, for harvest and post-harvest, for record keeping, and for water. This webinar today is not going to get into the specifics for them. I'm going to give a couple examples in a minute, but the basic point is that on-farm food safety and getting into compliance with FSMA is a process, and you can't make all these changes overnight. So start now and figure out what you need to do, and then create whatever list or whatever kind of organization process you would use to work through bit by bit small steps to get into compliance. One good thing to do is, one of the requirements for farms that need to be in full compliance with the law, if you're not aware of it, is you have to go to the FDA Approved Training, and right now there's only one approved training, and it's offered through the Produce Safety Alliance, which is on the screen here, and you can go to this website and see a list of all the upcoming grower trainings where you go, and in one day, over 8 hours, all those different categories we just talked about, they're gone over in depth, and you learn the specific requirements for FSMA. So for example, during that training, you will cover that for personnel qualifications and training, there is part of FSMA, this 112.22, that harvest employees need to be trained to recognize what produce to not harvest because it may be contaminated. For example, it has feces on it or it's close to feces. Harvest employees need to be trained to inspect harvest containers to make sure they are clean, functioning properly, and not a source of contamination. And they need to be trained to correct problems and or report them to a supervisor. That's some examples of what would be required under FSMA. Another area where there's requirements is for health and hygiene, and specifically for hand washing. For a wash station, a hand washing station under FSMA, these hand washing stations are required to have water that does not have any generic E. coli in it, single-use paper towels or some sanitary towel service or some sort of clean hand drying device, liquid soap, a gray water catchment, and a closed towel disposal. So you can see in this picture, this is not a state-of-the-art, stainless steel type setup here, but it's covering the basics required in the law, and it's a portable setup, and it can move around to where it needs to be in different near different fields. So you could have, piped in, plumbed hand washing areas in some parts of the farm where that makes sense, and then maybe in other parts of the farm you have hand washing stations connected to your porta potty service, or maybe you don't have that, so you build your own hand washing station like this. There's many different ways to meet the same requirements that the law has. Okay, and then for fully covered farms, there are also some recommendations. They are not requirements, but they're recommendations. And one of those is for the farm to have a farm food safety plan and to conduct a risk assessment. And CAFF, the Community Alliance with Family Farmers organization that I work for, we have free Word document templates of these different resources at that website. One important note is that FSMA does not require a third-party food safety audit for farms at the farm level. However, distributors and buyers that you might sell to may require a third-party audit to meet some requirement or food safety requirement at the distributor level. So a third-party food safety audit is different than FSMA. That's something that is voluntary and industry driven, whereas FSMA is a requirement and the law. So if you were to get a FSMA inspection, then that would be a mandatory inspection where regulators would come to your farm and do an inspection, whereas a third-party food safety audit is a voluntary thing that is sort of similar to organic certification, where you every year pay to have a third-party person come and review your paperwork and look at observe your things on your farm. And then in the food safety audit, they do that and they give you a score out of 100, and you would need to get an 80 or higher to pass. And so that's a third-party food safety audit, but that is different than FSMA. Okay, and then here is a overview timeline of different compliance dates. So for total farm annual sales, that's gross. For the biggest farms, which are over 500,000, the FSMA compliance actually started back in January 2018. And then inspections, like I mentioned, started earlier in April this year. And then the water section of the law that for the biggest farms, there's a few extra years until compliance with that section starts, because there's still some review going on to determine what every detail will be for the water section. And then you can see here, based on farm sales, there's different tiers and kind of a staggered timeline for when the compliance dates would start. Oops. Okay, so let me pause there, and Megan, let me know if there's some clarifying questions, please.
Yeah, thanks for that overview. And we did have one clarifying question come in that said, I became confused on the page that said either that if you sold a restaurant or to a grocery store, you are fully covered despite the level of income you are farming. Could you clarify that a little?
Yeah, so if you have less than $500,000 in gross sales, you have to then also sell the majority of those sales. So at least, more than half of your sales have to be directly to an end consumer under the law. And so an end consumer it's easy to know that an end consumer is someone you sell to at a farmer's market, or somebody who you sell to through your community supported agriculture or CSA program. But it's also considered an end consumer when you sell directly to one restaurant or directly to one grocery store. It doesn't count that you're selling it to an end consumer if you drop it off at a big distribution center and then they ship it out to a whole bunch of different stores. So hopefully that clarifies that you can sell to whoever you want to sell to, but under the context of FSMA, the different places you sell to make a difference in determining whether or not your farm is qualified exempt or needs to be in full compliance. And I recommend going to those earlier webinar that we mentioned, because we spend about 40 minutes breaking down that in different examples, but unfortunately we don't have time for that today.
All right, so this question might be a little long, and if that's so, we can get back to it at the end of the webinar or send a link. But someone was wondering, what's the definition of sprouts in FSMA?
Sure. The definition of sprouts, I actually have the text of the law pulled up. I mean, I think I have a good idea of it in my head, but I can just quickly pull it up right here.
Kaylee's doing that. That's just another note that text that's in the handouts that you have is a good reference if you ever want to look up definitions. They go through and define what they mean. So it's a really good resource to have.
Great, Megan. Yeah, so 112.141 under subpart M, which is called sprouts, and then right underneath it, it says 112.141. It says what commodities are subject to this subpart. The requirements of this subpart apply to growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of all sprouts except soil or substrate grown sprouts harvested without their roots. So that is the law defining sprouts as, basically they define it in reverse. So if you are growing something in soil and then you harvest it without its roots, the law does not define that as a sprout. So that would be the answer to that.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's all the questions we have for now. So we can keep moving, but if questions come up during the presentation, don't hesitate to send them in, and then we'll stop at the end of the second half of the presentation for more questions.
Great, thanks, Megan. Okay, so hopefully folks are up to speed here, and then let's start section 3 about for FSMA, for farms that are fully covered or need to be in full compliance, what are the general record keeping requirements? So there's different records for different things, like these 4 categories listed under number 4 here, but for overall, for any of the records that are required to be kept under FSMA, there's some general record keeping requirements. And first, we're going to talk about those here in number 3, and then I'm going to break it down by each of those sections in number 4. Okay, so FSMA record keeping method requirements. So when you're creating a record, this subpart O of FSMA, so if you went into the PDF of the law here and you went to 112, 161, you'd see that it says what general requirements apply to records required under this part. And when it says part, that means it's referring to the whole regulation. So number 1, except as otherwise specified, all records required must include, as applicable, the name and location of the farm, actual values and observations obtained during monitoring, an adequate description of covered produce applicable to the record, location of growing area or area that the record relates to, and the date and time activity was documented. So I know these slides, some of them, especially this one, are really wordy, but I did this on purpose so that, like we said, you have a PDF of these slides as a reference, so you can download that and print it out and have this as a note, so you wouldn't have to be like typing a lot of notes right now. So that was the first thing, the number 1, and then those specific bullet points underneath it. And remember, this says as applicable. So you know, if some of these bullet points under here might not be applicable. I can't think of a quick example off the top of my head, but I think it'll come up later. And then to continue, for these general record keeping requirements, except as otherwise specified, all records required must be created at the time an activity is performed, be accurate, legible, and indelible, be dated and signed or initialed by the person who performed the activity. And then this last point here is that certain records must be reviewed by a supervisor, dated and signed. And we will explain which records this applies to as we go through this later part of the presentation. And you can see in the text of the law, if you go to 112, 161B, you can see a list of where it lists out all the different numbers within the law of the different parts, where in addition to the record being created, with these 1 through 4 components that we just talked about on this slide and the previous slide, there's a handful of records where after all of these 1 through 4 steps are done, sometime in the near future after that record is created, supervisor needs to date and sign and review that record. Okay, and then there might be, obviously this is a presentation about FSMA and related to organic farming. So overall, you might be thinking, I already keep records for my organic certification. Is there any overlap between that and food safety and FSMA? And generally there is some overlap. And it's also really important to point out that you have already started keeping records and are keeping records for organic certification. So you already have a good culture of record keeping and a good mindset about that. And that will go a long way towards helping you get in compliance with FSMA record keeping as well. And then importantly, there's clear text in the FSMA regulation that does not require you to do anything that would be against National Organic Program standards. And that's 112.84. It says this regulation does not require covered farms to take measures to exclude animals from outdoor growing areas or to destroy animal habitat or otherwise clear farm borders around outdoor growing areas and drainages. So that's just really important text that it's in the regulation so that it's clear that you can succeed and be in compliance with both FSMA and food safety, as well as National Organic Program, biodiversity and conservation practices and principles, and what you need to do for organic. You can also still be in compliance with FSMA. FSMA has major additions beyond what you're doing for NOP in these areas, in worker health and hygiene and in water. Those two areas are not covered in organic record keeping requirements, are very little covered, and FSMA goes much more in depth, and we will talk about what those records are in a moment. Okay, so that was just a brief overview of the general farm record keeping requirements, and now we're about to dive into the real meat of this presentation. And I'm glad to see on a time check here we've got plenty of time, so let's work through these 4 areas here, and then we'll have we're going to take a stop for some questions after the water section of this. And Megan, feel free to jump in if there's questions at any of the other 4 areas. Okay, so for the first section, for the first area here of the 4, well, actually, let me take a pause. So within FSMA, as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, there are very few parts of the law that are prescriptive and tell you what exactly you need to do. And it's, there's clear black and white, this is the way you're supposed to do it, and this is what's not okay. For the records, these 4 areas, for personnel qualifications and training, for agricultural water, for soil amendments, and for equipment, tools, and buildings, these are areas where it's very clear, black and white, what records need to happen. And so today is focused on explaining these records, that it's clear by reading the law that these records need to be kept by farms. I'm going to be very honest and say that there's also a big gray area right now. As I mentioned, inspections just started in April this year, and everyone, including the regulators at the different state and FSMA inspection agencies and FDA, if FDA is doing the inspections in your state, everyone's still trying to learn and figure out all the processes and how this is all happening. So there's a lot of gray area as far as like beyond just the records I'm going to talk about today, where it's not clear. Maybe only the records I'm going to talk about today will be required, but maybe some other ones won't be required, but if you were under a FSMA inspection, they might be helpful, or maybe you want to keep them for your own good, for your own farms, processes and systems that you have in place. So, okay, I think that's enough on that. And as we go, I think that'll become clear, and we can follow up with that in the questions if people have additional questions. So it's clear with personnel training records for FSMA versus organic that organic regulation does not require farms to keep track of any of the personnel training or qualification records that FSMA requires. So in FSMA, all personnel training and qualification records required to be kept under FSMA are new records that organic farms now need to be, that organic farms that need to be in full compliance with FSMA now need to keep. So if you're an organic certified farm and your farm needs to be in full compliance with FSMA, what personnel training records do you now need to keep? Let's go to the next slide. We're going to talk about that. So the first thing is that you have at least one supervisor must attend the FDA approved training. And as I mentioned earlier, right now there's the Produce Safety Alliance, or the PSA grower training is one, right now the only way that you could complete this. So if you haven't had someone from your farm that's a supervisor or an owner go and do this course, then that'd be step number 1 in my book of getting my farm into compliance. Number 2, All personnel that handle produce must receive food safety training. So that training should be provided in a way that employees easily understand, especially if you have employees that speak languages other than English as their native language. And the training should be repeated as necessary. And then number 3, for work qualifications, all personnel should have a combination of training, experience, and education to adequately prepare them to behave in compliance with the law. Okay, or is anyone wondering, like, what kind of combination of training, experience, and education is adequate? Well, that's going to depend on your own determination at your farm. If you have, you know, a field crew supervisor that was working as a in the fields for 5 years and also took some community college classes or went to some conferences and or, you know, did some other side education before they became the crew field supervisor, then that makes, I mean, I think that would be an adequate combination of those things. You know, if it's somebody's first day on a farm ever and they're a supervisor just because they are your, you know, brother's kid that looks for their first job, but they don't have any farming experience, well, they're probably not going to be the best person. They're probably not going to have all the right qualifications to be helping to make sure that produce is harvested and grown in compliance with the law. But this, again, that's just going to be a call for you because you know your personnel the best and their qualifications. Oops. Okay. And then other important personnel training details that you need to do is to make sure that everyone on your farm is trained in principles of food hygiene and food safety, the importance of health and personal hygiene for staff and visitors, being able to recognize the symptoms of sickness that may contaminate food, and other related food safety information based on their job responsibilities. So this is important even if you have a couple people working in an office at the farm, to still train them, because who knows, maybe they go into the packing house area and get some food and take some food for themselves, and one day they are having, you know, they go home early from work because they're sick and they're vomiting in the office, but then they go walk into the packing shed and with their bare hands that they hadn't washed, touch a bunch of food and pick out their own food to bring home. So that person, if they weren't trained in knowing that, you know, different symptoms can be indicators that you would contaminate food, they would go in there and possibly contaminate food. So it's just important everyone gets trained in these first 4 bullet points there. And then additionally, if your employees that also do harvest, some smaller farms, you know, everyone would just be trained in all these topics because you have everyone doing everything. But in other farms, you might have specific people that only do harvest, and it's important to make sure that harvest employees know when to recognize when produce may be contaminated. Basically, you know, does it have feces directly on it or right near it? They need to know to inspect harvest containers and equipment to make sure it's functioning well, clean, and is not a source of contamination. Harvest employees need to know to correct any problems so that they are knowledgeable and know how to correct them, or when there's any problems with the harvest containers or equipment, and then to know when to report any problems to a supervisor. Okay, so based on those topics, FSMA for record keeping has a clear requirement to document your worker training. And here is an example template that has these various topics that we just talked about with these checkboxes up here, and an area where you can put the date and the trainer name, and the employee needs to print their name, and the employee needs to sign their name. And you could use this template to make sure you're covering the appropriate information for employee training, and then have a record of it, because FSMA requires you to have a record of training your employees. And that template could be found at that website if you click on the link for the employee training log. And then this is one of those records that must be reviewed by a supervisor. You couldn't see it on that screenshot on the previous slide, but the bottom part of that record has this supervisor review of record for them to sign and date it. So that's one example, a template that you could use, or if you have your own employee training record you already keep, but you don't have a supervisor review of it, then just add that to it and keep doing what you're already doing. You know, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Okay, so that is for personnel qualification and training, the requirements. It's the few slides we just covered, the different details of different types of training that's required. And then you basically need one record for personnel training, and that is this template here or some other version of it that you create, where you have every person at least once a year is signing their name, writing their name after they've gone through a training with you. And if it's a person who does harvest, they need to have gone through that training before they start harvest. It would probably be a good practice to, you know, upon hire, do this training with people, just so it's upon hire, and then have some date each year that, you know, in the spring or late winter in February or March, like retrain everyone so that there's some sort of system in place where you are doing this at least the minimum frequency. Maybe you need to do it every month, once a month. Just decide what works for your employees in the situation at your farm. Okay, so that is employee personnel training. And now we're moving into water required records for FSMA versus organic. So organic regulation does not require farms to keep track of any water records that FSMA requires, unfortunately. So all the water records required to be kept under FSMA are now new records that organic farms that need to be in full compliance with FSMA must now keep. There are 9 possible records that you will need to keep. 2 of these records all farms should keep, and the others may not apply to your farm. So stick with me here. If you're, you know, listening to the webinar and on your computer doing something else at the same time, I'd encourage you to focus just on this for a little bit, because this water stuff is extra complicated, and there's 9 possible records that we're about to walk through here. So for FSMA agricultural water required records, all farms that need to be in full compliance with FSMA will need to have these required agricultural water records. Number 1, document that at least annually you inspected your water distribution system. So that would be, you know, walking your farm property or driving if it's bigger and making sure you're checking, visibly looking at all of the parts of your farm water distribution system that you can see above ground, any well heads, any irrigation district channels, any ponds, any reservoirs, any creeks that you're pulling water from. You're literally eyes on the ground out there looking at your distribution system and making sure that you don't visibly see anything that would be of food safety concern. You know, you don't see a bunch of dead deer floating or on the edge of your water reservoir on your property. That would be alarming and a big food safety concern. So at least once a year, you need to document that you did that. And then the second thing that all farms need to do is to keep records of their water test results. And in bold here are the records that the law requires to be reviewed and to be signed off on by a supervisor. So your water test record results would be one of those where you would take your results that you get back from the lab, and then a supervisor would need to make sure to review and sign and date them. So these are the 2 things that all farms for their FSMA water requirements need to do. Now we're going to go through the other ones that may or may not apply to your farm. So if you are using some sort of treatment for your water, whether that's irrigation water, post-harvest wash water, or some other water you're using on your farm, you must have records to show that your treatment method is scientifically validated. So for example, if you're putting a sanitizer product into your post-harvest wash water, you need to make sure that that sanitizer is approved for the use that you're using it for, aka that it's scientifically validated. So for example, here I have an example sanitizer label, a product called Tsunami 100, and this label was pulled from the EPA website. You can see the entire label at this link below. This is the start of the label, and then on the next page, or on one page of the label, it says, if you're using the sanitizer for post-harvest wash water, you would need to mix it at 2.5 to 6.7 fluid ounces per 100 gallons of water, which would create a 30 to 80 parts per million of periacetic acid. And then you need to make sure to allow a mixing time of 1.5 minutes. So let's go back. Remember, if you are treating your water, you must have records to show that your treatment method is scientifically validated. Well, if you're using this product according to the instructions, then this would be a possible example for how to show that you are using a sanitizer product according to validated scientific method, right? Because the instructions on this product went through a review process through the government and through testing it. And so if you're using it according to how the instructions say to use it, then that would be a validated scientific method for how you're using it. So again, the label is the law, and making sure to do the right use of the product and making sure to use it the right way. Okay, so the fourth possible water record that you might need to keep, again, applies to if you are using water treatment. And this is that if you're treating your water, you need to have records of monitoring that process. So, for example, that last label said it needed to be between 30 to 80 parts per million for that treatment of the water. Well, you might mix it at first and it might be at 50 parts per million, but then after some amount of time of using the water, if you're not monitoring and checking that water every once in a while to make sure it's somewhat between that 30 to 80 parts per million window, and you don't know that all of a sudden the product is only 5 parts per million, it's no longer effective. And if you're not monitoring, then you don't know when it doesn't work anymore. And so the law requires that if you are treating your water, you need to be monitoring it so you know that it's working. And one tool or template that's out there for keeping track of this record is created by the Produce Safety Alliance. And there's an example of it right here, where it's got these different columns, and in each column there's the date, the time, the water pH, the water temperature, the turbidity, the sanitizer type, and the parts per million, any corrective actions, initials, and then this is one of those records that needs to be reviewed and signed by a supervisor. So this is just an example record I have here in orange in the middle that the sanitizer product you are using will determine which data you need to monitor and keep a record of. It may be different than this example, or you may only need to fill in some of the columns in this example, not all of them. So again, the point here is that if you are treating your water, you have to have a record of how you're monitoring that water treatment. So depending upon what type of sanitizer treatment product you're using, that would depend on what kind of monitoring actions you would need to take and then be recording. Okay, and then the next possible water record you may need to keep depends if you are using the microbial dieoff rate for agricultural water applied during production. So this relates to, you'd have to go to that Produce Safety Alliance course to learn if you're not sure what microbial die-off rate is. It's basically waiting some number of days after your last irrigation before you harvest if your water tests too high, if your irrigation water during production tests too high for certain pathogens. So one of the ways to document that you're using the right microbial die-off rate would be by using one of the resources that calculate the die-off rate for you, and the UC Davis Western Center for Food Safety, the University of Arizona Ag Water app, and the University of Arizona online calculator are all great tools that help you accurately calculate the number of days you would need to wait for microbial die-off. So the fifth water record that you may need to keep only applies if you're using this microbial die-off rate as a process to be able to use that water for irrigation. Then you need to make sure that you're using the right die-off rate, and you can use one of these calculators to help tell you. So for example, this is the UC Davis Western Center for Food Safety microbial die-off calculator. This is a screenshot of part of it. It's an Excel file. You add in your water test results, and then it tells you, so for example, for surface water, you need 20 test results to create your baseline. And then based off of that, it calculates how many days are necessary if using microbial die-off between last irrigation and harvest. So here, based on these water test results, this farm would need to wait 1 day between the last irrigation and harvest. So that would be one way to show that this fifth water record requirement would be met, because you used this tool and your numbers were inputted the right way, and then you found that you need to wait 1 day for microbial die-off. Okay, so the sixth possible record you may need to keep for water is if your agricultural water does not meet FSMA's water quality requirements, then you must document the corrective actions you take to be able to use that water. So some example corrective actions include using the microbial die-off rate that we just talked about, using some form of treatment, and we just talked about multiple records you need to keep if you're treating your water. And then also inspecting your irrigation system, and if you find a problem, correcting it, and then test your water again and you find that it's in the allowable range. So this is a record that would be kept if your water does not meet the water quality requirements in 112.44 of the law. And here's an example of using a template here to show this record that's required, and that's using your agricultural water die-off corrective measures template to show that you filled in the information and are waiting the appropriate number of days between your last irrigation and harvest. Okay, so you're doing great, sticking with me on this water section. We're in the last 3 possible records that you may need to keep. And these records are all even less likely that farms would need to keep them. But the first is that if you're using, number 7 here, if you're using water from municipal sources, like from a city water basically, then you must have at least an annual record of their water test results. You technically, under FSMA, don't need to take water tests at your farm if you're using city water for your water at your farm, but you do need to have at least 1 test a year of the test results that the city is required to do on its own water. And if you're not using any municipal or city water on your farm, then ignore number 7. That doesn't apply to your farm. So number 8, if you're using an alternative microbial water quality criteria or die-off rate different than what we've talked about earlier in this presentation, then you must have scientific data to document it. So I doubt this would apply to many farms on this webinar, but if you were working with the university or with basically a university to do additional research and find a different way to do some of this stuff that's required, then you would have to have scientific data to document it, but they would be creating that data with the process of working with the university. So likely doesn't apply to you. And then number 9, if you or the lab you're using for water testing methods is different than those allowed by the law, then you need to have scientific documentation of that equivalent method. So right now there's a whole number, like a big variety of water testing methods that labs are allowed to use to do your water tests. And that list of those methods is right down here on the slide, that link. If for some reason the lab you're using can't do or won't do any of the tests on that, any of the test methodologies, I should say, on that list, then you are, by the law, allowed to do a different method. However, you're going to need to prove that that method is equivalent. So that would be a very thorough, detailed process, and I'm sure number 9 would, I'd almost guarantee, would not apply to anyone on here. But it is something in the law that it said, and so as an educator, we just wanted to make sure to explain all of the details, and then you can decide if it doesn't apply. So those are the 9 water test records that may apply to your farm. Remember, the first 2 apply to all farms, and then the other 7, dependent upon your farm's water circumstances, may or may not apply. And then an important note about all these water records, the timeline for compliance for them is different than the timeline for all the other records. Remember, we had that big table earlier in the presentation. There is additional time that these water testing requirements, or water records, I should say, the 9 water records that we just talked about, those have this extended timeline. And it was noted in a Food Safety News article in February this year that provided more clarity on the water requirements and when those practices and records need to be completed. So large farms have until January 2022 to get into compliance with the water part. And this article clearly stated that if a large farm used surface water and needed to take 20 tests to develop their baseline, they do not need to have completed all 20 of those tests by January 26, 2022. They just need to have started to take those tests and be creating and keeping those records. And there's a link to the article on this slide, so you can check that out if you're interested. So basically, there was clarity that said you don't have to have every last detail perfectly in place by the water compliance dates. You just have to at least be started and starting to get into compliance with the water details by the dates listed here on this timeline. Okay, let me take a sip of water, and Megan, I'm sure there's some questions on all of that.
Yeah, we did have a couple of questions come in. Thank you for going through all the details on that. One question is, you talked about municipal water, that if you're on municipal water, you just need to get the test from the city or the municipality once a year. But if you are getting water from an irrigation district, is that the same thing, or would you need to do additional tests to that water?
Yeah, good question. So getting water from an irrigation district is not the same thing as a municipal source. Municipal or city water is treated and is drinking water, basically for humans, whereas irrigation district water is oftentimes surface water that's exposed to the air and travels in open air ditches and to farms, and is highly likely to get contaminated at some point along the way. So if you have irrigation district water, FSMA at this point in time requires you to take the water tests at your farm, where you have the water at your farm.
Great, thanks. And then Could you go back to the water table? That one there. So someone was wondering, is the total sales based on the gross or net?
Good question. I should update that. It should say gross farm annual sales.
Okay.
So yeah, it's gross.
Great. And then I also just wanted to mention that we also have a webinar that we did last year that goes into a lot of the details of how to take a water sample and things to think about when you're doing a site assessment of your water. So that's another really good resource. If you have more questions kind of beyond the record keeping for the FSMA water requirements, and we'll include that later in the presentation. So it looks like we've covered all of the questions that have come in for now, but if you have additional questions, feel free to send them in and we'll get back to those at the end of the presentation.
Great, thanks, Megan. Okay, so, now we're going to move on to the third area of 4 that has specific FSMA record-keeping requirements. And this is the biological soil amendments of animal origin section of FSMA, or what you can just think of as soil amendments that have animal inputs or are purely animal in nature. So there may be some overlap in the soil amendment input records required for organic certification and those for food safety for FSMA. So just as a reminder, FSMA is only concerned about biological soil amendments of animal origin. And this crazy acronym of biological soil amendment of animal origin is one that consists in whole or in part of material of animal origin, such as manure or non-fecal animal byproducts, including animal mortalities or table waste, or alone in combination. The term biological soil amendment of animal origin does not include any form of human waste. So basically, as Megan mentioned earlier, biological soil amendments of animal origin, some examples of them would be manure, blood meal, bone meal, feather meal, fish emulsion. So different amendments you'd put on your field, in your field, on your plants that have some part of animal component in them. So in this category, fortunately, there are not 9 records. There are 3 possible records that need to be kept for food safety. The first record is 11260 that is only applicable to farms if you make your own compost. So if you make compost on farm that has animal inputs, then you need to have documentation that the correct process was followed, and specifically that you have records on the time that the pile was there, the temperature, and the turning, the different components with that. So this is a bold record, so this is one of the ones that the law requires to be reviewed and signed off on. If you are not making any compost on farm, then ignore this record. This doesn't apply to you. Here's an example for a template. If this record does apply because you are making on-farm compost, then the Produce Safety Alliance has a template record on this that has the different elements that are required to be kept for the on-farm compost making requirement. Basically, there's 2 different methods allowed to be done for on-farm composting. There's a static method or a turned compost method. And as it sounds, the static method, you don't turn it, and the turn method you do, and there's they both have to be above 131 degrees, but for different number of days depending upon the process. So if you want to see the specifics of those 2 methods, you can look in the PDF of the law here that you can download, and then if you go to 112.6.60, you can see it'll go into more specifics about the different static and turn composting methods and the different, so you know. And then in addition to that Produce Safety Alliance template, there's also a different template that the USDA and the National Center for appropriate technology have that you can find at this PDF and this website link. And just to note that there needs to be a couple modifications to this template to have it fulfill everything that FSMA requires. So it has a column for the date here, and then you'd also want to add the time the temperature was taken or when the compost was turned. And then this record as it currently exists does not have a place for the supervisor to review, sign, and date this record, so you'd want to make sure to add it. Okay, so that was the first record that's required if you're making on-farm compost. The second two records apply to if you buy treated amendments or inputs that have animal inputs. You need to have these records for each product. So the first is that the company that made the product needs to give you some sort of written documentation that they process the product according to validated scientific processes. So if it's pelletized chicken pellets, there's some scientific process that's been validated about the high heat and the pressure that they put that product under to create the little pellets, and the amount of time it is under that high heat for the product to be considered quote unquote treated, because if there was any pathogens in there, they would be killed below a level that is of concern. So I don't know what that is off the top of my head, but there are different validated scientific processes for these companies that make bone meal and blood meal and chicken products and things like that. So the companies that sell those now need to provide the farmers with this paper that they're saying that says that they've done the validated scientific process. And then the second component is that the company has to say that they've also say on that paper that they've handled, conveyed, and stored the product in a manner to minimize the risk of contamination. And so you'll need annual documentation of these two things for each product that you buy in. If you buy the same 5-gallon jug of fish emulsion 6 times a year, you don't need to get these two documentation components every time you buy that exact same fish emulsion product. You just get it the first time you buy it that year, and then once a year make sure to get the updated paperwork for it. So here's an example soil amendment supplier for FSMA compliance. They would have their company name, and then they'd send to you and whatever date it happened, that they've processed their fish emulsion product according to validated scientific processes, and that process was monitored adequately. They also confirm that the fish emulsion product was handled, conveyed, and stored in a manner to minimize risk of contamination by an untreated soil amendment of animal origin. This is just an example here. A company may format this slightly differently. I'm just giving an example here of how this could look. Okay, so that was the third category. Now we're on to the fourth of 4 categories. So we're nearing the finish line here, so stay with us. Good job. So for FSMA required records for equipment, tools, building, and sanitation, there may also be overlap in the cleaning records required for organic certification. So in 112.140B2 of FSMA, it states that growers must keep a record of the date and the way they cleaned and sanitized equipment used in harvesting, packing, and holding activities. And again, this record must be reviewed and signed by a supervisor. So if you are already keeping this record for organic certification, then you would not need to have a duplicative record. However, there are a couple important differences between the organic and the FSMA equipment cleaning requirements. The cleaning logs for organic are required in organic production to prevent the cross-contamination of organic and non-organic products, while the cleaning logs required for FSMA are to prevent contamination of equipment with pathogens that may cause illness to humans. So they're not exactly, like the records aren't exactly being asked to be kept for the same reason. But if you're keeping the information on the record that fulfills both organic regulation and FSMA regulation, then you don't have to have a duplicative record. But organic farms may need to implement new equipment cleaning procedures not currently in the organic system plan to meet the FSMA equipment cleaning requirements. So to go into this a little bit more specifically, here's an example template for cleaning and sanitizing record that is also from the Produce Safety Alliance that you can see here at this link. And again, this needs to be signed by a supervisor. But depending upon what kind of equipment and tools you use for harvest and packing and storage activities, and what kind of frequency you're cleaning and sanitizing those at, then you would need to have the record of when you do that. You may have a certain policy that you sanitize your truck that you do delivery in at a certain frequency. So you would make sure to note when you do that. There's different tools and equipment on every farm, so it's hard to it's impossible to give a universal, this is how you would do it. But in general, just thinking through the different tools and equipment and buildings and that you have, and then how and when do you clean and sanitize them, and then determining what kind of record you would need to make sure to keep of when that actually happens. There's also a CCOF template that you can find at that website link there that is an equipment cleaning log. So if you're keeping this already, then maybe it would be easier for you to just add in some modifications so that this already existing record is in compliance with FSMA. So you could add the farm location to the form and the time the equipment was cleaned, and then add a reference to FSMA related cleaning procedures not in your SOP or your OSP, I mean. So your organic system plan might not have a standard operating procedure or instructions for the steps you take when you clean and sanitize your wash tanks in your post-harvest area. And if you don't have that procedure documented somewhere, then you would want to write it when you have your record that you keep here. And then additionally, you have to have this record reviewed and signed and dated by a supervisor. Okay, so let me pause there maybe and see if Megan, if there's any questions on soil amendments or on buildings, equipment, tools, cleaning stuff.
Okay, great, thanks. So yeah, if you have any questions about these two last sections, feel free to write them in. And I think I would just add, as all organic growers know, that before you use any sanitizers or any soil amendments or any inputs on your farm, always run those by your organic certifier to make sure that you're using them in compliance with the National Organic Program regulations. So let's see, give people a little more time to write in questions. I was wondering, Kaylee, in the FSMA language for compost, it has some language about adequate curing after you've held the compost at the temperatures that it requires and turned it. Do you have any information on what they mean by adequate curing or how that's being interpreted?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I referenced there that you could go into the text of the law and see the details for static and for turned composting, you're exactly right. It says in there different details, and then it kind of ends with the phrase adequate curing. And to my knowledge, I don't know where that's defined, if anywhere, in the law or elsewhere. So that's a good question that could be submitted to the FDA's Technical Assistance Network, or TAN network, where they accept questions that people have on FSMA stuff, and then get back to you, email you back answers. So that's a good point. I don't know the answer to that.
All right, great, thanks. So I think we can wrap things up. And if there's any last questions, feel free to send those in, and we'll have a little more time for questions if there are.
Okay, thanks, Megan. I just have a couple last slides here that I've been talking a lot about different links and things. If you go to CAFF.org, this is a little screenshot because I know it can be a little hard to navigate our website. But if you hover over programs, this drop-down tab comes up, and then if you hover over food safety, this sidebar comes up, and then if you go down, you can see this fact sheets and food safety plan templates is where we have a number of templates. Also, just download the PDF of this presentation. There are so many different links out to great resources in this presentation as well. And then if you click on that template page, it brings you to this page where we can't even see half of it here, but there's a whole bunch of free Word document templates of different types that are in English and Spanish, and you can use any of those if those would be helpful for you. And then just a brief note, I mentioned way in the beginning about a farm food safety plan. We have a resource on here that's hard to see, but it says Simplified Food Safety Plan for Growers under the middle section there. And if you download that, you'll see this template here that helps guide you through creating a farm food safety plan, which is sort of the parallel thing to an organic system plan for organic certification, whereas for food safety, the farm food safety plan helps you get all of your farm's food safety key details organized in one place. And this is a screenshot of the start of that. So if you're interested in creating that, I just wanted to let you know that that resource was available. So Megan, if there's not any questions, I'll let you take it from here, or if there are, let me know and I'll do my best to answer.
All right, great. So I think we did have one question coming in and about emailing slides after the presentation, and yes, we will definitely email a PDF of the slides out to everyone who registered for the webinar, as well as a recording, so you can go back and listen again. And I think if you have any additional questions, I know this was a lot to digest. It was a lot of really detailed information. If something comes up, Kaylee has her email there, and feel free to shoot her a question. And I think, Kaylee, thank you again for a really great detailed presentation and going through all of the water requirements and everything else. You give people a lot to think about and to go back and digest later on this week and moving forward. So thanks for being here, and I think with that we'll just wrap things up.
Sounds good. So
as we mentioned a couple times during the webinar, there is a nice collection of FSMA-related webinar recordings that we've done in collaboration with CAFF as well as UC Davis. So you can check them out. These are all on the CCOF website, and we have the links there. And just a few general food safety resources. CCOF has a food safety resource page. We also, Wild Farm Alliance has really good information for organic farms that are wanting to balance food safety and their conservation measures like hedgerows and pollinator plantings and whatnot. And also the National Organic Coalition has a good flow chart if you're still trying to figure out what where you fall in FSMA. That's another good resource. It asks you some yes/no questions and sort of leads you through a chart as to where you fall within the regulation. And just to note, we have a bunch of new programming coming up in the fall, so keep an eye out on the CCOF website. And thank you very much for attending, and we always love to get your feedback. If you could fill out the evaluation form that pops up when you close out of GoToWebinar. It helps us improve our offerings and get ideas for future events. So have a good afternoon, and thanks again for joining us.